Hello and welcome to the Whitehall Sources podcast, where we take you inside politics at Westminster. I'm Calum MacDonald. Hello. And also on the podcast, Kirsty Buchanan, who was a special advisor to the Prime Minister Theresa May. Hello, Kirsty.
Yes, and ho.
And political strategist Joe Tanner. Hello, Joe.
Hello.
Lovely to have you both
I don't know how
with
to
us.
follow that, really.
No, I think sometimes you just got to let these things go, don't you?
It's just Kirsty, isn't it? It's Kirsty being Kirsty, as we would say, like we used to say about Boris.
Exactly. Right, there is suddenly loads to get through on the podcast today. In a few minutes, we'll be focusing on the budget, and you'll be hearing from James Nation, who served as a special advisor to the Chancellor, Rishi Sunak, from 2020 to 2022, among other roles as well. But we'll welcome James in just a sec, because I think it's worth us both just reflecting, a story breaking since Prime Minister's questions this lunchtime, that a manhunt is underway after a 24-year-old Algerian man was mistakenly released from prison. The Met Police say they were told by Wandsworth Prison at 1 o'clock yesterday that the prisoner had been released in error 6 days earlier than that, on Wednesday the 29th of October. We are awaiting confirmation on his immigration status, which has become pertinent in these sorts of conversations after events of the last few weeks. This all really erupted at Prime Minister's questions and after Prime Minister's questions. The Shadow Defence Secretary James Cartledge was pressing Deputy Prime Minister David Lammy, they were subbing in for Keir Starmer and Kemi Badenoch today, on whether any asylum seekers had been mistakenly released since Hadush Kabasu last month. David Lammy kind of swerved that 5 or 6 times, he was asked. He didn't really answer. Now, just as we've started recording on Wednesday afternoon, Stephen Swinford, political editor of The Times, posts, "I'm told David Lammy had a pre-prepared statement that was ready to go on the accidental release of the migrant sex offender as he stood at the dispatch box. It expressed outrage on behalf of victims and criticised the Tories, but he didn't use it, instead refusing to comment when it was repeatedly put to him. David Lammy is said not to have wanted to preempt any statement from the Met Police. The statement was there in case the news broke during Prime Minister's questions. But as Stephen Swinford suggests, there are mounting questions in government this afternoon about his refusal to answer very pointed questions from the Tories on it, and the somewhat defiant tone that he took in the Commons. And I think, Kirsty, that's my thing about this, is that since Prime Minister's questions, we have learned that his staff in the Justice Department had been working on this, quote, through the night, said a statement from David Lammy. So why not get ahead of the Met Police, especially since the question came up? Why would that be such a problem?
This is the $60 million question, isn't it? Except perhaps that the answer being that, as I think it was Rob Jenrick branded him last week, he's just Calamity Lammy, and this is a prime example of it. Look, I have been doing politics a very long time, and I was trying to think of a PMQs that I had watched that was frankly weirder than this one. James Cartledge, in effect, asked him exactly the same question 5 times, and 5 times he kind of dodged it, didn't answer it, didn't say yes, didn't say no, didn't say I don't know, just shouted a lot about the mess that the Conservatives left the justice system in. And at which point you expect, because he's asking this very specific question, that on the 6th question, Cartledge would go, ta-da, and pull a rabbit out of a hat and say, well, actually, we can reveal that there has been, after Hadush Kabatu's release accidentally, there's been another migrant sex offender who's been released. That didn't happen, which left everyone sort of scratching their head and saying, we were expecting a rabbit out of a hat, and all we got was kind of a hat. So that was one of the issues. And the other one, the name of all that is holy, as Lammy clearly did know that there had been a second release, why on earth he didn't simply say so? The government's own public accountability bill, regards, I think it was brought in the back of Hillsborough as a kind of duty of candour. Now, you can argue about whether he did or didn't mislead the House, but as the late, great Alan Clark, a former Tory minister, used to say, he was certainly economical with the actuality there. So I honestly don't know what he was thinking and why he didn't just say, yes, there has been And in his statement he put out afterwards, which was even more inexplicable, he said the public deserves answers. Well, why on earth didn't you give them during PMQs?
Yeah, well, this is the thing that I can't quite get around. Isn't this exactly what the Commons is for? Is to update the public on matters on which the public need to be updated. Joe, what is your analysis on this? I mean, as we're speaking, the whole thing is kind of unravelling pretty quickly. And once again, the Tories have absolutely landed and beasted the Labour Party at PMQs.
Yeah, I mean, there's a few things. There was an interesting. I heard someone say that I think David Lammy as the first. I'm going to probably get this wrong, but I think there was the point that David Lammy was making history as I think the first black of Afro-Caribbean descent to do PMQs. I think there was a milestone there. It was a first for him, which should be something to celebrate. However, what's interesting now is this is unravelling as the afternoon's wearing on, because Downing Street have said that the PM was not aware of the second migrant apparently being released. And also, Sir Keir Starmer's spokesman told reporters that the Met had then released a statement and then said that they couldn't confirm when Mr. Lammy knew. Now, in reality, if you're standing in for someone and something quite big's happened after something quite big had previously happened not that long ago, which was quite a big deal when it happened and is very newsworthy. I'm amazed there is not a WhatsApp or a communication of some sort that says, ooh, we've got a problem and I'm going to have to deal with it. The idea that he said he dodged the question repeatedly and now nobody can confirm when Lammy did know and what Lammy knew when he knew, just to me just stinks a bit. And I think I just think if you're doing that job, that the worst of all of this is that if you're doing that job, if you are in PMQs, standing in at PMQs, which to be fair, people have criticised the fact that it's repeatedly not the Prime Minister and it's other people. I have some sympathy with the fact that the Prime Minister's had a lot of other stuff to do out of the country. But if you are going into PMQs, you still have a top team around you preparing you for it, and you are standing in as the person to answer PMQs, not justice questions, not home affairs questions, not questions about your constituency, not what you had for breakfast that morning. It is your job to be across everything. And I mean everything. And therefore, if you knew something and you were being asked questions, the parliamentary process is for you to respond honestly and, well, I mean, honestly, as honestly as you can, as governments do. But your role is to be scrutinised and to answer the questions you're being asked. Now, he therefore has failed if he did know. And the idea that he's waiting for a Met statement is clearly
ludicrous.
The Tories knew something, right? That's what they knew this and they were going with it. So.
Yeah, I think the idea of waiting for a Met police statement is bonkers. Go on, Kirsty.
Yeah, I mean, just to pick up on something Joe said there, it doesn't even have to be across every other brief. This is his brief. He is the Justice.
That's what's even worse. Exactly.
I find the whole thing utterly baffling. Look, I used to work in the Ministry of Justice, and at least 3 times I was woken up in the middle of the night because it is a highly operational department with obvious kind of public safety implications. So in an emergency situation, I would often be woken up in the middle of the night, and I would often then ring the Prisons Minister because it was almost always about a matter that had happened on the estate. So I find it very difficult to believe that someone who had been accidentally released a week ago, and that officials had been working on that overnight, that the Justice Secretary didn't know. And if he was livid about Kabatu, we must be absolutely kind of off the chart on this one. And if he look, so our choices here for Lammy, or Lammy's choices for what it is here, is he dishonest or is he incompetent? Neither is a great look.
No, certainly not. Do you know what? Let's bring in our guest this week, who is James Nation, who was a special advisor to the Chancellor Rishi Sunak, but then went on to serve as deputy head of the policy unit at Number 10 for Rishi Sunak as Prime Minister as well. Hello, James.
Hi, Calum, and thanks very much for having me this week. And was just listening to you guys and your exchange on Lammy. And look, I've been focused on budget stuff, so I haven't been paying that much attention to PMQs. But the one bit I was just going to offer, and Kirsty, you'll know this as well. PMQs is quite a Rolls-Royce operation behind the scenes, right? And when the Prime Minister is not in town, whoever is deputising gets access to that operation. And I can tell you, it's number 10 asking for real-time briefs from departments right up until the wire that you then pass, if needs be, through the box physically to whomever is answering. So I just wanted to offer that because it struck me something maybe has gone a little wrong here in terms
James,
of getting him up to date and up to
James,
speed.
if it's normally a Rolls-Royce operation, this was a Trabant.
Not familiar enough on my cars to comment, Kirsty, but I just, I think that bit to me was interesting as well, that this is a part of number 10 that normally have this process down. And I think something today maybe hasn't quite worked, was all I was going to offer.
And there has to be a bigger question, which was, if this was last week, why on earth did we not know this person was on the street between then and now? So this is I'm honestly getting from I'm getting the vibes, and I hate using that word, but I'm getting this feeling about like that period when I did Boris's campaign. It was all about maladministration and sort of cock-ups under Ken in London and things going wrong. And this Calamity Lammy sort of phrase that's been used, it goes bigger than that, right? Because yes, it's the Justice Department, but ultimately, surely we're hearing from Downing Street, this happened a week ago and the PM did not know that it happened a week ago. Like that is seriously worrying, right? As to how government's working.
Totally. Part of the buzz on Twitter, and it's not, for me, it's not a justification, but it seems to be people are using it as an attempt at one, is that there are way over 200 mistaken releases of prisoners every year, as if that's some kind of reason that we shouldn't know any specifics about this.
But not one who is a migrant sex offender who is released literally days accidentally after another high-profile migrant sex offender has been released.
Yeah.
This is a political nightmare. Number 10 should have known. Lammy certainly would have.
James, can I ask, just on the point you made, the Rolls-Royce operation that is PMQs, if that had been functioning well today, how should and could this have gone?
Well, look, again, I want to be careful because I've not lived the ins and outs of this case. And also, I know those are some fantastic number 10 civil servants, some of the best who operate that machine. But normally what you find, Calum, is you have a number 10 briefing operation constantly on the departments for hot topics, right? And knowing that it is going to be the Deputy Prime Minister and that therefore his brief may well come up, making absolutely sure that the MOJ are getting to you well in advance areas of vulnerability, key defensive briefing on areas like, prisoner and early release, for instance. And you run that right to the wire, is my point. You can, in the worst case scenario, you get something out of a department at 11:58, you can still make sure it's with the Prime Minister, or in this case the DPM, on the front bench. So I don't want to do a disservice to the number 10 guys nor to the MOJ guys. Who knows? It's just in this instance it feels like maybe something has slipped through and that has been potentially politically costly here.
And a small but very significant matter: who on earth let Lammy go into the chamber without a poppy on his lapel? Yes. And he was going to have to raise the issue and had to borrow a poppy from a veteran to put on his lapel halfway through PMQs. The whole thing was a absolute shoddy mess.
Yeah,
Kirsty, we've been there. That's on the spads. Like I've got mistakes that I could. So it's not. But that is where you've got to just, all the private office. You've got to just realise, he himself, of course, but that's where you've got to do the check for something like that before you go out there.
Yeah, at least there was a veteran there to be called upon to serve at least one more time. Right, shall we go on? We've got James here really to talk about the budget. In light of this unprecedented speech by Rachel Reeves yesterday on Tuesday, in which, well, the sort of takeaway really from it is it's a bit of context for the budget, but the context really is that we're all going to face some tax rises in a few weeks' time, isn't it, James? She's all but confirmed that. What is your take on what the purpose of this speech was?
So I think the way I see the purpose of it, Calum, is there's a temptation when we're in this game, observing things as Whitehall sources or as fiscal policy nerds, certainly in my case, that you bake certain things in and that you assume that, everyone knows that certain tax rises are coming, that she's going to, for example, Chancellor, have to continue the freeze in thresholds, for example. But the public aren't necessarily there at all. And so my read of it was you needed to try and find a way to cut through and start to make a political argument for the very top level point that last year you said you'd basically done a one and done with 40 billion or so of tax rises and you wouldn't be coming back for more. And whatever the particular choice is, in a few weeks' time, you're going to have to come back again with significant tax rises. And if you've not been paying attention to politics, which a majority of the public would be forgiven for not doing so, you need to at least do something to try and explain why that is the case. Not least because, and Joe and Kirsty will know this, on a budget day, so much gets lost. So your attempt to try and pin it all on the Tories or to explain the productivity downgrade, I mean, good luck holding people's attention there, but to try and explain all of this stuff on budget day, it just gets lost. And I think what she was trying to do is try and seize a bit of a moment to do some of this pitch rolling and preparing the ground weeks in advance. But obviously what it's done then, Calum, is it's set speculation running on particular measures, as you say, and people are already reaching conclusions on what that might mean for manifesto pledges or otherwise.
Yeah. If she was to go on and break a manifesto commitment, and the commitment was not to raise income tax, not to raise VAT, and not to raise national insurance contributions for employees. If she was to break the commitment on one or multiple of those, would the raising tax be more of an electoral difficulty, or would the fact that she had broken a promise be more of an electoral difficulty?
So I think it's a combination here, actually, Calum, not to just completely cop out, but I think taking a step back as well, I do just want to, a lot of people, and we're at this stage of the budget process where someone is going to be wrong, right? And I run that risk. There's nothing like being on the inside. You don't really know. And I can believe they're worried enough that multiple options are on the table, which is why she did need to roll the pitch yesterday. But I don't take yesterday's speech to think that an increase in income tax rates is necessarily nailed on, right? I see that as worse. I see that as the worst thing she could do, put up the basic rate of income tax. That's not the same as continuing the freeze in thresholds. It's possibly not the same, Calum, as doing this quite cute idea called the switch, that is income tax up, national insurance cut. Like, for me, the real egregious thing here is if you were to go back on your explicit word that you were not going to put the rates up on income tax and then you go and do that. And I think the political cost, really, the literature for the opposition parties writes itself, doesn't it? Like, from a conservative perspective, I mean, those of us who were working on the last election campaign might be forgiven for just pausing for a little bit and saying, hang on a minute. And then on the reform side, great, another example of the two major parties lying to you. So I think and then I think there is that point, just to come back to your question, Calum, of when it is, I think, the Labour Party on a tax pledge, I think there is just, and Kirsty and Joe will have views here, something in the kind of public psyche, if you like, that makes a breach on that, really quite damaging. So that's how I see it, Calum.
That's really helpful. Yeah, go on, Joe. What do you think about that?
I mean, I think you're, James, we should have you on regularly. I think you're spot on there. I think this whole issue around, it's not just about breaking an election pledge. It's the damage it does to your party, your colleagues. They already had enough problems over just winter fuel, which was never part of a plan that suddenly appeared from nowhere and was done, and then they had to reverse it. The idea that they're then going to go explicitly back on something they have already said that they wouldn't do is, I think it is so much more catastrophic than any of us can necessarily comprehend. But we are also in a situation where what is it that actually happens if they do that? while it might be incredibly difficult, while there might be lots of headlines, while there might be an absolute mutiny by the party, we are also in a position where it's not like the Tories where you can get rid of the leader as easily. It's, Keir Starmer is still sitting on a majority. Most of his MPs aren't that sure about him anyway. And he's not that sure about a lot of his MPs if you read the sort of the narrative that's out there, and doesn't spend a great deal of time talking to them, meeting with them, sends out minions to do that. And would he at some point just do something pretty major and, cut Rachel loose in the future? Because he's not that loyal to people either, it seems, when you look at how many people have disappeared from around him. So as much as I just feel like we're in a situation where what you would normally expect, and when I've spoken to quite a lot of people. I've been around long enough in this game, but there are people that have been around another 20 years longer than me, and they go, "Oh, this could never happen." And I go, "Well, actually, I'm not sure you can say that anything is on or off the table right now." I feel like I don't think anyone wants to make any bets on anything. I thought it was fascinating that George Osborne and Vince Cable were up at the, I think it was a Treasury Select Committee, where George Osborne said that that the Tories and the Lib Dems in government had agreed to cut the top rate of tax from 50 to 40%, and that apparently it was Cameron that vetoed it, so they never did it. And it was actually in exchange for then new higher bands of council tax on more expensive homes. So there was sort of some of the things that have been mooted. You can sort of hear, they've been round that sausage factory at some point. And he actually went as far as to say that was actually something they'd got agreement for, but then it didn't happen. So, there are loads of areas they could go in this, lots of different options. But I just feel like whenever I say things about, Rachel's future might be in doubt, I get it, and I get why people go, "Oh, no, she's very safe." But I just don't buy that anymore. I just think it's still an administration, right? It's still an administration breaking a manifesto pledge, which is a big deal.
Yeah. Kirsty?
I agree with James. I don't think it's bolted down yet. I mean, James will be able to explain better than I can, but this week the Treasury is working out the major measures. So in other words,
Yes.
what the major things it's planning to do to fill that black hole. We still don't know exactly how big and scary that black hole is, but big and scary it most definitely is. Those major measures then go to the Office of Budget Responsibility. They are kind of in effect scored, and the Office of Budget Responsibility comes back to the Treasury on Monday and says, I mean, James, step in here if I'm getting this wrong, but effectively, yes, this will work, or no, it won't. So the point that I'm making, and the point that James touched on, was we are not being played here. This is not about the Treasury going, "Oh, well, let's pretend that we might have to put up taxes, and then when we get to the budget, they'll go, actually, we've managed to find some money down the back of the sofa and we were fine." This isn't expectation management. This is a genuine, lots of things are on the table right now, including a potential 2p across the piece income tax rise, which, bear in mind, we haven't seen in this country for 50 years. This would be not only a major tax intervention, it would also be a major breach of one of the key manifesto pledges. This government was elected to create change, and at the moment, the public are understandably entitled to say this looks like more of the same chaos that we had under the beloved Conservative Party that we so comprehensively threw out of office. And they promised to develop that change on two foundations. One was trust and one was growth. Well, last year, Rachel Reeves embarked on a £70 billion spending splurge in her budget, including £40 billion worth of tax raises, including £24 billion worth of tax raises on businesses who are the engine of growth. The IMF in April, the chief economist of the IMF in April said, the main reasons that we are downgrading growth in Britain, yes, a little bit of it is about the global economic climate in wake of Trump tariffs, but the main drivers of our downgrade of growth in Britain are domestic drivers. In other words, the decisions that Rachel Reeves took in the budget last year. So, and James is absolutely right. She did that and then went to the CBI after the budget last year and said, right, that's it. That was a once in a parliament kind of eye-watering tax thing, not going to have to come back again. And yet, here we are, a year later because, surprise, surprise, funnily enough, putting £24 billion worth of taxes, additional taxes on business isn't great for growth.
Yeah. James?
Yeah, so firstly on process, Kirsty's absolutely right. There are two phases with the OBR. There's pre-measures, and we're at the end of that. On Halloween, she received the final pre-measures forecast, and that tells her the size of the black hole she's dealing with. That's where she'll know what they were going to do on productivity, etc. And then now we're post-measures. So this week, as Kirsty says, is the back and forth between the Treasury and the OBR over what combo of measures add up, basically. And then you get that first post-measures forecast on Monday, and then a few more days, I think, to really, really nail it down. But it is very much squeaky bum time now in terms of making those final decisions. And then just because I think we should do a bit of, what story is she trying to tell? Because I think we're all agreed it's a very tough situation for the Chancellor. Well, keep an eye on when it comes to the cost of living. She is, I think, going to try to find some ways to deal with this issue on energy bills. Expensive, but whether you can find some change in the mix to move some green levies off bills or look at that on domestic energy bills, because they know that is a flank they need to neutralise. Like whenever they get hit with you guys said bills would decrease by 300 quid, they need to be able to say something in response. And that's why I think they're focused on that. And then the other thing as well is we talk about the budget last year. One of the things the budget last year did is it forced the OBR to put up their expectations for inflation. Like the government cannot afford for that to happen this time round, given where inflation is in the UK relative to other economies. So a big thing she's going to want to do is she's going to want to show to the Bank of England and others, the choices I've made have not worsened inflation here. In fact, if anything, I'm doing things at the margin that are going to help people on energy bills. I might hold down rail fares. I might continue to cap bus fares. You see what I mean? Just things like that where she can say, we're not going to be a problem for the bank. And actually that means we're doing our bit to help get inflation under control, which is another way to try and stabilize things in the markets. But look, does any of that cut through politically when you've got to do big tax measures like we're all, I think, agreeing here? I'm not sure. And then I just think, and I'm going to underscore it again, because both Joe and Kirsty have touched on it in different ways. It is a massive choice to breach the manifesto by putting up income tax rates. And that's why when I see headlines this morning saying a rate rise is nailed on, I do just think, hold on a minute, this is big.
Agree.
And I think they're waiting and seeing what they can make work.
And I think that is because it is such a big deal that I think you're right about all this other. I mean, the fact that that briefing came out about 100 different areas being looked at, tax and spend measures, like you can tell that they might. I mean, is there a risk, James, from a storytelling point of view, which we talk a lot about this government, but there is a risk that they could sort of overcomplicate the whole thing by bringing in lots of little tinkering bits where they do make some other relatively seismic move, but then say, but we've helped you in all these ways. And everyone goes, I haven't got the foggiest what that all means, because it'll be so complicated to work it out from the sausage factory that it doesn't mean anything to most people.
Look, there's risk either way, right? And I think you've got to weigh up, because remember, like my experience of budgets is you work your socks off to try and, prevent any gremlins, but you've no idea really where those gremlins are going to emerge from. And you are petrified
pasties, not gremlins. They're
exactly.
pasties.
Yeah, pasties rather than gremlins. Pasty-shaped gremlins, I don't know.
Pasties or caravans, wasn't it?
You know what I mean? Like you're just you are petrified that weekend afterwards, and you're useless to your mates, your family, and your partner, because you are like, is my thing going to break and be the thing that is a Sunday scary story? And then has the budget held going into Monday? And I make that point because I think it supports what you're saying, Joe. That is, if you go for this alternative scenario of stacking up and sharing the load through all these mini changes, you don't know which of those is going to cause an issue. If you do a big council tax increase on bands G and H, that's over 1 million properties. Like, they're not going to be happy. And papers are going to run on that. So there's political pain any way you cut this, which is why I want to be like in all humility about it. You could imagine them talking themselves into a situation where it's like, right, we want to have one simple fight rather than multiple fights. And maybe I'm wrong, but I just come back to, would you take the politics of having, yes, loads of small rows, but still you can broadly try and make an argument through gritted teeth your manifesto holds, as opposed to, ripping off the Band-Aid and putting up income tax rates, given the wider situation this government faces. And I still think the political risk of the latter is larger than the former.
But James, don't you think that the idea that they're actually considering the nuclear option is more about the fact that, frankly, the size of the budget hole, and particularly her need to build out more headroom than the 9.9 billion she's had before, the size of the hole is what is dictating the kind of worst case scenario driving factor, rather than, well, do we pick loads of small fights or do we pick one big one? It's frankly, you need to go that nuclear because you need to raise that much money because the hole is much bigger than we thought it might be.
Yeah, I think it's large enough, Kirsty, that these have to be options on the table. In that, I definitely agree with you earlier that I don't think we're being played, but I still think you've got to. I think it is larger, but I think it is still of a size that is enough to potentially have a way to stack it up without breaching. And that's based on kind of just my own view of how you could cobble various funds together. But look, again, like you start to get into some very difficult territory. You're having to go quite big on revenue raises on pensions, for instance, which we know is a very controversial area in and of itself. And, you don't need me to tell you, given what's happened with winter fuel and everything, that has been a big area of political difficulty for the government so far. So, yeah, for sure, what they will have seen behind the scenes, regardless of where exactly the final number ends up, is clearly enough to worry them sufficiently that doing something like this is on the table. Whether they still do it, I think that's still in the ballot.
And are we in terms to take from that speech yesterday that, to all intents and purposes, we can forget this Labour government having any kind of meaningful impact on reducing overall public sector spending, particularly on welfare?
So welfare's a very difficult one. They're not going to be able to do anything really for this fiscal event. They've got this Tim's review that is running to next year. I think they're really going to struggle there, given what happened with Labour MPs. I think, Kirsty, you actually may see her pencil in some spending restraint, like try and do some fiddles with departmental spending in some of the later years. But the question will be, can we believe that? Going into a general election and with another spending review in 2027, I mean, the pressure on departmental spending is only going to be one way as far as I see it. So, as you guys know, you can do some cute stuff on spending as Chancellor because you don't face an immediate vote on it. You can pencil in assumptions. The OBR might tell you off, but you can be quite cute with that actually. And the rubber tends to hit the road later when you're doing spending reviews and when the cabinet kick off. But I don't rule out that she tries to just do something on the departmental side, so it's not all tax rises, but on welfare, jury definitely still out in terms of whether they can come back and have another go here, given where Labour MPs are.
And again, with an eye to the bond market, she again repeated that the fiscal rules are sacrosanct to her. The reality is these fiscal rules are a load of old hooey, aren't they? I mean, they're based on something that may or may not happen 5 years out on the basis of a Office of Budget Responsibility that's as wrong as it's right. Why have we got this slavish devotion to something that most of the time isn't worth the paper it's written on?
Yes, exactly. So I think that from my point of view and kind of talking to people about this, the precise design of the fiscal rules doesn't really bother people all that much. But once you've set them, you then have to stick to them. And I think, there are techie arguments we could get into. And as you could probably tell, I love this stuff. So you probably have to shut me up after a while. But you could get into some quite techie arguments over how Rachel Reeves has designed current budget balance is actually quite unhelpful for her and tighter than it needed to be. But that's all immaterial now. She's staked out the turf that she's staked out. She's defined the fiscal rules as she's defined them. If you are then seen to fiddle those for your own advantage, well, that is then costly for you. And so I don't think it's that market participants wake up every morning and think, yeah, the precise design of Rachel Reeves's rules is fantastic. It's that, okay, the UK government has now set these parameters to condition themselves. They can't now be looking to break these for political expediency because they'll pay a price for that when it comes to borrowing costs.
That's the real long tail of Liz Truss, isn't it? That and mortgage hikes, of course.
Yeah, look, I mean, that whole episode didn't help. I mean, probably understatement of the call, but obviously declare an interest as a Rishi person. But yeah, I think it clearly, I think there is a fair point about the aftermath of that. But equally, there's a fair point as well that you've seen movement since the budget last year, I think I would say this, wouldn't I? But I think, the steps taken by Rishi and Jeremy did help restore and repair a lot of that damage before. But for sure, the UK has been in a kind of position that none of us would want it to be in, where international investors look carefully at the decisions made by UK politicians and maybe for the first time for a while pause now and think, have these guys really got a grip?
Can I ask James as well then, just for a bit of insidery how the Treasury kind of operates, how much room, generally speaking, does a Chancellor have to do something that I might call unconventional, something a bit different, something that might surprise us? I'm wondering, is there literally a bookcase where they can go over and sort of take something out and go, oh, I don't like that idea, and put it back on the, how does it actually work when it comes to idea generation? And here's an option we haven't considered before. How about this?
So I actually, to give the Treasury a lot of credit, because they're a building that gets slammed quite a lot.
Yeah.
I found them, they definitely have their biases and they definitely have areas where they're stronger. So, you'll always hear, oh, the Treasury isn't really a growth-minded department. It's fixated on tax and spend. And I get that, because tax and spend is what they control. But you also have some of the smartest people in Whitehall who do have a lot of growth ideas, like on planning. The challenge is always, do the politicians buy into it? And do other departments who are responsible for the system naturally buy into it? And actually what I saw, to be fair to them, and look, I wasn't there around furlough. A lot of people try and claim credit for the furlough scheme. I wasn't working for Rishi then. I joined in December. So that was December 2020. So those are the guys before me. But what I did see actually is there was actually quite a fast pace, albeit it was a crisis environment where, Rishi, the team, someone else would have an idea and the machine could respond quite quickly. But it all comes back to control, Calum. If you've got the direct levers, which Treasury tends to do on tax and spend, then you can potentially move quite quickly. If it's more complex and you need other areas of government down to delivery agencies on the front line to shift, then that's much harder. And then because of the process that we have, it's then very difficult at this stage in the process with a budget to basically be like, I don't care about the scorecard. I want to completely start again. And I've got a wilder plan, because, we can criticize the OBR all we like. When I hear people criticize the OBR, I want to say, what's your alternative, guys? Because someone somewhere is going to have to do a forecast and make certain assumptions on how ideas stack up. It might not be the OBR. If it was the Treasury, we'd worry that politicians were leaning on them. Yeah. So someone somewhere is going to have to make a judgment, and you need to allow time for that judgment, which means surprises this late aren't really done.
It's interesting that, because I wonder if there's something that we haven't considered that she's going to be able to stand up and say towards the end of November, and we're all going to sit there and go, whoa, where did that come from? I'd love to be surprised by some sort of unconventional thinking, I suppose.
Yeah, so I think on this one, what would I say the surprises might be? The surprise would be if the forecast is actually better than we've all assumed. And actually,
we could get an interest rate cut tomorrow, couldn't we? Bank of England's meeting tomorrow.
Yeah. Which again, I kind of think, I don't want to overstate the extent to which the government can influence that, right? Yeah. And that always bristles with me slightly when I hear government ministers claim credit for interest rate cuts.
Yes.
And people would say, throw back in my face, well, you guys claim credit for cuts to inflation. I'd say, well, okay, yes, the bank do control that, but the government can help, which is why, Calum, I think, just watch out for deflationary giveaways, not to get wonky. Does she take another penny off a pint? Does she, keep the bus fares cap? Things like that, that she can say is not really adding to price pressure. And then I think the big surprise would just be, that the forecast is not as bad as externals have been fearing, so that she can then say to markets, don't worry.
And how dangerous, James, do you think the fuel tax stuff would be? Because fuel tax has been that's been the Sun's big campaign. When you talk about working people, particularly working people that you think of as perhaps traditionally Labour working people, you suddenly go, oh my gosh, there are a lot of people that you clobber when you start tinkering with fuel duty. But it is obvious, surely, that fuel duty is a challenge and is also an area where, you know, the government's been losing revenue anyway because of the switch to EVs, that fuel duty is sort of a problem child to some extent, but it's also a, do you ever go there because of almost seeing a block of voters that you could imagine you lose straight away if you go into that? But it can't be protected forever, surely.
So, Joe, there are certain things that areas where Treasury officialdom is desperate to have a conversation and get something out there, and the future of fuel duty is one of them. So, you know, the Treasury official side will absolutely worry about fuel duty receipts in years to come and want to start a conversation now about, you know, pay per mile and alternatives and getting that going. And, you know, that is always something that from the political side you were fearing, right? Because you worried about a war on motorists pushback coming your way. And then to your direct question, you've got the issue around fuel duty. And there was obviously a story this morning. Look, I think the worry for the government is that the OBR could turn round one day and say, we don't believe what you and previous chancellors have done, which is say that you're going to roll forward this 5p and freeze for another year and then come back to it. So I'm sorry, we're going to score this as a permanent tax cut and you need to fund it. And that is always a worry, right? And that is a big one because I think the cost rises to something like 4 billion.
When does a temporary become a permanent? Because it has
Exactly.
been going for quite a while, right? I mean,
exactly. So
that is a problem,
at the
isn't
moment, it's the problem at the moment, the government's word. And this is where you get into quite dangerous territory, Joe, because the OBR takes the government's word at the moment that it is temporary and they'll come back. But what happens when the OBR start to challenge that and say, well, you never do that. We don't believe you. But then that's quite worrying if the independent forecaster is saying to the elected government, we don't believe you on something. So this could get quite interesting. But just immediately, I would just say normally Treasury officials would, first decision they'd put on the Chancellor's desk, or probably the first decision would be means test the winter fuel allowance. We've seen how that's gone. But the second one would be uprate fuel duty. However, this time round, I do just think the Treasury hold off because they'll be worried about inflation. So I do think actually, my view, they find a way of continuing to fund the freeze and cut next year. It then just becomes this conversation with the OBR over, can we get away with saying we're going to come back to that in future, or is there a bigger hole that we need to fill in?
How does the OBR respond, though, when you get to the stage of a manifesto? If you had a manifesto pledge and then you said, I'm not coming back, like, where does the OBR go with that? If you think the public are going to feel let down, how are the OBR going to respond to it?
Yeah, well, on that, I think they just, to be fair, on a manifesto breach, they will take government policy as read. I think the kind of scenario I'm talking about is one where if you're them, the OBR, you have good reason to doubt the believability of it, right? So, you know, an example I've given you is fuel duty. I could quite easily say the same about spending cuts penciled in for 2029, right? Like for after or just before the general election, you know, but it is quite something for the OBR to turn around and say, you know, we are not going to score something that's government policy. Usually what you get is some quite grumpy language from them, either in front of a select committee or in their documents as well. But I do think we're in quite an interesting phase in terms of OBR government relations.
James, you have been extremely generous and insightful on the pod today. Thank you so much. Thanks for your time.
Thanks for having me, guys. I've really enjoyed catching up with you all. Hope to see you soon.